June 12, 1944, 6 kilometers east of Saint-Lô, Normandy. Dawn broke with a dull grey light filtering through low clouds as Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann surveyed the assembly area where 30 Panzer IV tanks stood in perfect formation, engines idling with a low mechanical growl that vibrated through the soles of his boots. The morning dew clung to the olive-green steel of the German war machines, giving them an almost ghostly appearance in the early morning mist. Hartmann smiled with confidence. The Americans had landed, but the full might of German engineering would soon send them back into the sea. "We will be in Carentan by nightfall, and then we will show the Americans what real soldiers can do," he remarked to his radio operator, certain that no improvised American defense could possibly stand against the disciplined force he commanded. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Hartmann could not possibly know as he climbed into his command tank was that within 48 hours, a 21-year-old farm boy from Georgia, with nothing but a pair of wire cutters and an idea born from years of fixing broken farm equipment, would devise a solution that would render the feared German Panzers vulnerable in ways their designers had never anticipated, transforming the balance of power in the hedgerow country of Normandy. Private First Class. Marcus Washington crouched in the muddy ditch alongside a narrow country road, his uniform soaked through from the persistent drizzle that had been falling since before dawn. The sky hung low over the Norman countryside, the color of beaten lead, matching the leaden feeling in his stomach. Around him, 24 other men from Baker Company, 761st Tank Battalion, huddled in similar discomfort, their faces etched with exhaustion and worry. "You think they're really coming this way, Sarge?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible over the distant rumble of artillery. Staff Sergeant Thomas Miller nodded grimly. "Intelligence says the Krauts are mobilizing a Panzer regiment to counter our push toward Carentan. Our tanks got stuck in those damn hedgerows, so now it's up to us to slow them down." Marcus glanced down at the standard-issue M1 anti-tank mine in his hands. The circular metal disc seemed absurdly inadequate against the 40-ton German tanks they were expecting. The 3 trucks that had delivered their platoon contained barely enough mines to create a proper defensive line. "We don't have nearly enough of these to stop a full Panzer column," he observed, turning the mine over in his hands. Sergeant Miller spat into the mud. "Battalion knows that, but they're spread thin everywhere. We got what we got. Make it work, Washington." Marcus nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead of the problem. Growing up on a struggling farm in rural Georgia, he had learned early that when you didn't have the right tools, you improvised. When machinery broke down, you fixed it with whatever was at hand or you didn't eat. His father had taught him that. "Sir, what about those telephone wires we passed about half a mile back? The ones knocked down in the bombing?" Miller looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "What about them? I've got an idea, but I'll need a couple of men and permission to try something." Captain William Harrison stood with his back to a crumbling stone wall, studying a map spread across the hood of a jeep while rain pattered against his helmet. At 34, Harrison was older than most of his company officers, having joined the army after years working as a civil engineer in Pennsylvania. The deep creases around his eyes had grown deeper since D-Day, 6 days earlier. "Let me get this straight, Private Washington. You want to delay deployment of our limited mines to go collect telephone wire?" Harrison's tone was skeptical, but not dismissive. "Yes, sir," Marcus responded, standing straight despite his fatigue. "The Germans use steel tracks on their Panzers. If we string heavy gauge wire between trees on both sides of the road at specific heights, it could damage their tracks, or at least delay them while we set up a proper ambush." Harrison studied the young soldier. Marcus Washington had been with the unit since training at Fort Benning, always quiet but observant. While some officers had been reluctant to place African-American soldiers in combat roles, Harrison had noticed Washington's mechanical aptitude immediately, often finding him helping the maintenance crews when off duty. "And you know this will work because—" "My father's tractor, sir. Back home, we had a field with an old fence. Wire got tangled in the treads once, wrapped around the drive sprocket, tore up everything inside, took 3 days to fix." Marcus pointed to the map. "These roads are narrow with hedgerows and trees tight on both sides. Perfect place to string the wire where they can't see it until they're right on top of it. Harrison considered for a moment. Traditional doctrine didn't cover this scenario, but they were desperately short on options. Take Simmons and Rodriguez. You've got 2 hours. After that, we deploy whatever mines we have, wire or no wire. In 1941, as German Panzer divisions swept across the Russian steppes at 40 kilometers per hour, Wehrmacht engineers conducted extensive testing on their tank designs at the proving grounds in Kummersdorf. Colonel Heinrich Voller supervised trials specifically designed to test the vulnerability of the Panzer IV's running gear against various obstacles and battlefield debris. The testing was meticulous, 78 different scenarios ranging from concrete barriers to anti-tank ditches, wooden obstacles to barbed wire. The final report, spanning 117 pages, detailed every potential vulnerability. Barbed wire caused minimal damage, typically breaking upon contact or becoming harmlessly entangled. The testing team concluded that no form of wire, cable, or rope presented any significant threat to German armored vehicles. The report was distributed to all Panzer divisions with a confidence bordering on arrogance. What the German engineers failed to consider was what would happen when multiple strands of heavy-gauge copper telephone wire, significantly stronger than typical barbed wire, were strategically placed at precise heights to engage not just one part of the track assembly, but multiple components simultaneously. This oversight would prove catastrophic. Marcus worked with a focused intensity, his wire cutters snipping through the thick rubber insulation to expose the copper beneath. Corporal James Simmons and Private Miguel Rodriguez had helped him collect nearly 800 meters of wire from the downed telephone poles, coiling it carefully to avoid tangles. "You really think this will work?" Rodriguez asked, helping Marcus stretch a length of wire between 2 sturdy oak trees on opposite sides of the road. They were working in the gathering dusk now, racing against both time and the approaching German column. "It worked on my daddy's John Deere," Marcus replied, twisting the ends of the wire together with practiced hands. "Tank treads are more complicated, but the principle's the same. Get it wrapped around the drive wheel tight enough, it'll jam everything up." Simmons glanced nervously over his shoulder. "Germans have engineers, Washington. Pretty sure they thought about wires." Marcus paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool evening air. "They probably tested with single strands or barbed wire. We're setting up multiple lines of heavy-gauge copper wire at different heights, and we're doubling and tripling some of them." He pointed to the narrow road. "Tank comes through here at speed, hit 6 or 8 of these at once. All that wire's going to wrap around the bogies, idlers, and drive sprockets simultaneously." As Marcus demonstrated the technique to the others, he recalled his father's careful lessons on their small farm. Benjamin Washington had been determined that his son would understand not just how to use tools, but why they worked the way they did. Despite having only a third-grade education himself, the elder Washington possessed an intuitive understanding of mechanics that he passed on to his son. "Tension is key," Marcus explained, pulling the wire taut before securing it. "Too loose, it just pushes aside. Too tight, it snaps on impact. Just right, it wraps and tangles." Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. "Where'd you learn all this, man?" Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "Georgia Clay doesn't give up crops easy. You either learn to fix what breaks with what you've got, or you don't eat." By 2100 hours, they had established 3 separate wire traps along a half-kilometer stretch of road, with the densest concentration at a sharp bend where tanks would need to slow their approach. Each trap consisted of multiple strands positioned at varying heights, some aimed at the lower return rollers, others at the higher drive sprockets, and some directly at the track itself. Captain Harrison inspected their work with a critical eye, then nodded his approval. "Good job, Washington. Now let's get those mines deployed to reinforce this position." Guided by Marcus's suggestions, they placed their limited supply of anti-tank mines not across the entire road as doctrine suggested, but in specific locations where a tank with damaged tracks would likely veer or stop. It was an unorthodox approach, but it maximized the impact of their limited resources. As they finished their preparations, Harrison gathered the men around a crude map drawn in the dirt. "Intelligence reports the German column will likely reach this position shortly after dawn. They'll be moving fast, trying to reach the American lines near Carentan before our air support can target them. He looked at each man in turn. Our job is to delay them long enough for air support to arrive. If Washington's wire traps work, great. If not, we fall back to position Bravo and try to hold them there. That night, as most of the men tried to catch what sleep they could, Marcus sat against a tree methodically cleaning his M1 rifle. Private First Class Michael Collins, a lanky farm boy from Iowa, dropped down beside him. "Can't sleep either, huh?" Collins asked, offering Marcus a cigarette. Marcus accepted with a nod of thanks. "Just thinking about tomorrow." "Your wire idea, you really think it'll work?" Marcus struck a match, cupping the flame against the light rain that had started again. "Honestly? I don't know. Makes sense in theory. But those are Panzers, not tractors." Collins was quiet for a moment, then said, "My granddad fought in the last war. Said sometimes it's not the fancy weapons that win, but the simple tricks nobody expects." He glanced at Marcus. "Never thought I'd be fighting alongside a colored soldier, you know. Back home we didn't mix much." "We don't mix much in Georgia either," Marcus replied evenly. "Yeah, well," Collins seemed to struggle with his words. "Just wanted to say, that wire idea was smart thinking. Don't matter to me what color the man is who might save my hide tomorrow." Before Marcus could respond, Collins stood and walked back to his position, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and the soft patter of rain on leaves. Dawn came with fog clinging to the hedgerows, limiting visibility to less than 100 meters. The men of Baker Company were in position, rifles and bazookas ready, though everyone knew their light weapons would do little against German armor. Their best hope lay in Marcus's wire traps and the possibility of air support later in the morning, if they could delay the German advance long enough. At precisely 06:35, the distinctive rumble of tank engines reached them through the fog. Captain Harrison, crouched behind a fallen tree trunk with Marcus and Sergeant Miller, raised his binoculars. "Here they come," he whispered. "Looks like they've got infantry support too." Through the fog, the dark silhouettes of Panzer IV tanks appeared, moving in a staggered column formation. The lead tank was approaching the first wire trap, completely unaware of the danger. Marcus held his breath, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure the others must hear it. Oberleutnant Hartmann stood in the commander's hatch of his Panzer IV, eyes scanning the foggy road ahead. The narrow Norman roads with their ancient hedgerows made him uneasy. Perfect terrain for American ambushes. But intelligence reports indicated minimal American presence in this sector, and his orders were clear. Push through to Carentan as quickly as possible to counter the American advance. "Dietrich, increase speed," he ordered his driver. "We need to clear this area before the fog lifts and American aircraft appear." "Jawohl, Herr Oberleutnant," responded Gefreiter Hans Dietrich, the tank's driver. The Panzer lurched forward, accelerating to nearly 30 kilometers per hour. Dangerous on the narrow, winding road, but necessary given their timetable. In the gunner's position, Unteroffizier Werner Schmidt nervously scanned the hedgerows through his viewport. "I don't like this, sir. We're moving too fast for this terrain. The Americans are still consolidating their beachhead," Hartmann replied dismissively. "Our intelligence says this area is clear, except for perhaps a few scattered infantry. Nothing that can threaten a panzer regiment." As the lead tank rounded the bend in the road, Dietrich suddenly shouted, "Was ist das?" But his warning came too late. The Panzer IV hit the first set of wires at 28 kilometers per hour. To the watching Americans, the initial impact seemed anticlimactic. The heavy tank barely slowed as it burst through the copper lines. For a moment, Marcus felt his heart sink, thinking his idea had failed. Then, gradually, the effects became apparent. The multiple strands of heavy copper wire, rather than breaking on impact, had wrapped around the tank's running gear, just as Marcus had predicted. Some strands ensnared the drive sprocket, others wrapped around return rollers, and still others tangled in the road wheels themselves. With each meter the tank advanced, the situation worsened. The wire drew tighter, began binding components together, and interfered with the track's articulation. Metal screeched against metal as the wire forced mechanical parts to work against each other. 50 meters past the first trap, the lead Panzer's left track suddenly seized completely, the accumulated wire having jammed the drive mechanism. The tank lurched violently to the left, then ground to a halt, its engine roaring futilely as the driver tried to regain mobility. The second tank in the column, following too closely, had no time to stop. It swerved to avoid collision, hitting the second wire trap with even greater effect. Both its tracks became entangled simultaneously, and the tank slewed sideways, blocking the narrow road entirely. Within minutes, 4 Panzers had been immobilized by the wire traps. The German infantry, advancing alongside the tanks, found themselves exposed as their armored protection ground to a halt. Confusion spread through the German column as commanders tried to assess what had happened to their seemingly invincible machines. "It's working," Sergeant Miller whispered in amazement. "Son of a gun, it's actually working." Captain Harrison wasted no time. "Radio operator, contact headquarters. Tell them German armor has been halted at our position. Request immediate air support." From his vantage point, Marcus watched as German tank commanders emerged from their hatches, shouting orders as crewmen scrambled out to inspect the damage. The Germans seemed baffled by the simple trap that had disabled their sophisticated war machines. "Now we hit them with everything we've got," Harrison ordered. "Washington, your wire bought us time. Let's make it count." The Americans opened fire with their limited anti-tank weapons. Most bounced harmlessly off the Panzer's armor, but the tanks were now stationary targets, vulnerable in ways they had never been designed to be. More importantly, the German advance had been halted at the precise moment when American P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers were beginning their morning sorties over the Normandy battlefield. Major Richard Vandermeer banked his P-47 Thunderbolt sharply to the left, scanning the Norman countryside below. The early morning fog was burning off rapidly under the summer sun, revealing the patchwork of fields, hedgerows, and narrow roads that had become the newest battleground in the war against Nazi Germany. "Bluebird 6 to all aircraft," he called over the radio. "We have reports of a German armor column halted approximately 6 kilometers east of St. Lo, moving to investigate now." "Roger that, Bluebird 6, came the chorus of acknowledgements from the 7 other pilots in his flight. As Vandermeer dropped to a lower altitude, the situation came into clear view. A column of German tanks bunched together on a narrow country road, several of them visibly immobilized, with small arms fire flashing from the surrounding hedgerows. It was a target too perfect to believe. "Jackpot, boys," he announced to his squadron. "We've got at least 20 Panzers on the road below, and they're not going anywhere. Looks like someone down there gift-wrapped them for us." Inside his disabled tank, Oberleutnant Hartmann was in a state of disbelief. He had climbed halfway out of his commander's hatch to survey the damage, only to be driven back inside by American rifle fire from the hedgerows. His driver and bowgunner were outside the tank now, frantically trying to clear the wire that had somehow wrapped itself around nearly every component of the track assembly. "How is this possible?" he demanded over the radio to the other tank commanders. "What kind of trap is this?" "It's just wire, Herr Oberleutnant," came the incredulous reply from another tank commander. "Telephone wire by the look of it, but it's wrapped so tightly around the drive sprocket that we cannot move without dismounting and clearing it manually." Before Hartmann could respond, the distinctive roar of aircraft engines cut through the air. Looking through his viewport, he saw what every German soldier in Europe had learned to fear: the silhouettes of American fighter bombers descending toward their position. "Aircraft!" he shouted into the radio. "Everyone back in your tanks! Take cover!" But it was too late. The first P-47 screamed overhead, its 850 caliber machine guns strafing the length of the column. Seconds later, the first bombs fell, landing with devastating accuracy among the tightly packed German armor. From their position in the hedgerow, Marcus and his comrades watched in awe as the American aircraft pounded the trapped German column. Tank after tank erupted in flames as bombs found their marks. German infantry scattered for cover, many cut down by the fighters' machine gun fire. "My God!" breathed Sergeant Miller beside him. "It's a turkey shoot." Captain Harrison was already on the radio, directing the air attack and reporting the success of their improvised trap. As he did so, he placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Washington, I don't know if they give medals for thinking quick, but what you did here today, you saved a lot of American lives." Marcus nodded silently, watching the destruction below. He felt no joy at the sight of burning tanks and dying men, only relief that it wasn't his comrades suffering the same fate. War, he was learning, offered no clean victories. The air attack lasted less than 20 minutes, but its effect was devastating. Of the 30 Panzers that had begun the advance that morning, 19 were now burning hulks. The remainder had been damaged or immobilized. The German thrust toward Carrington had been blunted, not by superior American armor or artillery, but by a farm boy's understanding of how wire could tangle machinery. As Baker Company regrouped to move to their next position, word of what had happened spread quickly through the ranks. Soldiers who had barely acknowledged Marcus's existence before were now clapping him on the back, offering cigarettes, and retelling the story with growing embellishment. "You should have seen the Krauts trying to untangle that wire," Collins told a group of replacements who had arrived that morning. "Like watching someone try to unravel a fishing line in the dark with boxing gloves on. All the while our planes are coming in hot." Colonel James Fitzpatrick, commanding officer of the 761st Tank Battalion, arrived at their position shortly before noon. A tall, imposing man with silver hair and a perpetual scowl, Fitzpatrick was known throughout the division as a demanding but fair leader. He had little patience for excuses, but gave credit where it was due. "Harrison," he barked as he climbed out of his jeep. "Report." Captain Harrison saluted. "Sir, German armor column neutralized as ordered. 19 enemy tanks destroyed, the rest damaged or immobilized. Minimal casualties on our side. 3 wounded, none killed." Fitzpatrick's eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps the closest he ever came to showing surprise. 19 tanks? With what? "Last I checked, your company had only a handful of mines and exactly 0 anti-tank guns." "Sir, one of my men devised an improvised method using salvaged telephone wire to disable their tracks. Once immobilized, we called in air support." "Show me," Fitzpatrick demanded. Harrison led the colonel to the remains of one of the wire traps, explaining Marcus's technique as they walked. Fitzpatrick listened in silence, occasionally nodding. "And whose idea was this?" he finally asked. "Private First Class Marcus Washington, sir. He's a farm boy from Georgia. Said he once saw wire tangle up a tractor back home." Fitzpatrick's face remained impassive. "Bring him to me." When Marcus was brought before the colonel, he stood at rigid attention, unsure what to expect. African-American soldiers rarely received recognition, no matter their contributions. Despite the official policy of the United States Army, many officers still harbored deep prejudices. Fitzpatrick studied him for a long moment. "Private Washington, Captain Harrison tells me this wire trap was your idea." "Yes, sir." "Where did you learn about such things?" "On my father's farm, sir. We couldn't always afford proper repairs, so we learned to understand how machines work. Once saw telephone wire wrap around a tractor's drive wheel. Took 3 days to fix." Fitzpatrick nodded slowly. "You understand what you accomplished here today, Private?" Marcus hesitated. "Slowed down some German tanks, sir." "You did considerably more than that, son. Initial reports suggest this was the main German armored thrust meant to counterattack our forces near Carrington. By stopping them here, you likely saved hundreds of American lives and preserved our foothold in this sector." The colonel turned to Captain Harrison. "I want a full report on this technique. We'll distribute it to all frontline units immediately." Back to Marcus. "As for you, Private Washington, I'll be recommending you for the Bronze Star." A murmur of approval ran through the gathered soldiers. Marcus stood speechless, unable to process what he was hearing. "Thank you, sir," he finally managed. As Fitzpatrick prepared to leave, he paused beside Marcus. "My father was a farmer too," he said quietly. "Always told me the simplest solutions are often the best ones." Seems he was right. With that, he climbed into his jeep and departed. That evening, as Baker Company established their new position 2 kilometers closer to Carrington, the story of Marcus Washington's wire trap had already spread throughout the battalion. Soldiers from other companies came by specifically to meet the Wire Man, as Marcus was now being called. Technical Sergeant Frank Whitman, the battalion's senior maintenance officer, sought Marcus out specifically. "Washington, isn't it?" Whitman asked, seating himself next to Marcus as the latter cleaned his rifle. "Yes, Sergeant." "Heard about what you did. Smart thinking." Whitman was a heavy-set man, with grease perpetually embedded under his fingernails. "Word is you're good with mechanical problems." Marcus shrugged modestly. "I manage." "We're setting up a forward repair depot about 1 kilometer back. Could use someone with your kind of thinking. Captain Harrison says you can be temporarily assigned to my unit if you're interested." Before Marcus could respond, artillery shells began falling nearby, the Germans' response to their earlier defeat. Men scrambled for cover as the distinctive scream of incoming rounds filled the air. "Think about it," Whitman shouted over the explosions. "Let me know tomorrow, if we're still alive." As darkness fell over Normandy, Marcus found himself unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. The events of the day kept replaying in his mind. Somewhere out there, German officers were likely puzzling over how a simple strand of wire had defeated their mighty Panzers. Little did they know it was the idea of a black sharecropper's son from Georgia who, until 2 years ago, had never traveled more than 20 miles from his home. His thoughts turned to his father, Benjamin Washington, working their small farm back in Georgia. What would he think if he could see his son now? The man who had taught Marcus to find solutions with whatever was at hand, to understand not just how to use tools, but why they worked. "Your mind is the best tool you'll ever have," his father often said. "Can't nobody take that from you." As Marcus finally drifted towards sleep, distant artillery still rumbling on the horizon, he wondered if his father somehow knew that his lessons had saved American lives today on a battlefield thousands of miles from home. In a captured French farmhouse, serving as a temporary headquarters for the 21st Panzer Division, Oberst Wilhelm Müller slammed his fist onto the wooden table, causing maps and coffee cups to jump. "Telephone wire?" he roared in disbelief. "You mean to tell me that an entire Panzer regiment was halted by civilian telephone wire?" The exhausted messenger, one of the few survivors from the decimated column, stood rigidly at attention. "Jawohl, Herr Oberst. The Americans strung heavy-gauge copper wire across the road at multiple points and heights. When our tanks hit them at speed, the wire wrapped around the track assemblies." Müller paced the small room, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "And our engineers never considered this possibility." Major Heinrich Schmidt, the division's chief engineering officer, cleared his throat nervously. "Herr Oberst, we conducted extensive testing on various obstacles, including wire and cable. Standard barbed wire poses no threat to our tanks." "Clearly we tested the wrong type of wire," Müller snapped, "or the Americans have developed some new form of tank trap we haven't encountered before." The truth, that this devastating innovation had come not from American military engineers, but from a single private's farming experience, would have been even more humiliating had they known it. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a rarity in the typically overcast Norman summer. Marcus awoke to find Captain Harrison standing over him. "Washington, grab your gear. Colonel Fitzpatrick wants to see you at Battalion HQ right away." Marcus quickly collected his belongings, his mind racing with possibilities. Had something gone wrong? Was the commendation being rescinded? As they drove in a jeep toward the headquarters position, Harrison sensed his anxiety. "Relax, Private. The colonel was impressed, very impressed. I think he has something specific in mind for you." At battalion headquarters, a collection of tents nestled in a small apple orchard, they found not only Colonel Fitzpatrick, but also Brigadier General Robert Milligan, Assistant Division Commander, waiting for them. Marcus stood at rigid attention as the officers studied him. "At ease, Private Washington," General Milligan said. "Colonel Fitzpatrick has told me about your innovative solution yesterday. Most impressive." "Thank you, sir." "I understand you have a background in farm machinery repair." "Yes, sir, my father taught me." Milligan nodded thoughtfully. "We're establishing a special engineering detachment to develop field-expedient solutions to problems our troops are encountering. Colonel Fitzpatrick thinks you might be valuable there." Marcus blinked in surprise. "Sir, this isn't conventional warfare anymore, Washington. We're fighting in terrain the Army never trained for. These hedgerows are killing our tanks' mobility. We need men who can think outside the manual." Fitzpatrick stepped forward. "The detachment will be based at division headquarters. You'll work with engineers to develop and test solutions, then help train other units to implement them. Your wire trap technique is already being deployed by 3 other companies this morning. Marcus struggled to find words. This was far beyond anything he had imagined possible when he'd suggested using telephone wire the previous day. I'm just a private, sir. I don't know if I'm qualified for something like that. General Milligan smiled slightly. Son, yesterday you disabled 19 German tanks with telephone wire. I'd say that qualifies you. As Marcus left the headquarters tent, his mind whirling with the implications of his new assignment, he noticed a group of German prisoners being escorted to the rear under guard. Among them was a German officer, his once immaculate uniform now stained with soot and mud. Their eyes met briefly as the German passed. In that moment, Marcus saw something unexpected in the officer's gaze, not hatred or contempt, but a grudging respect tinged with curiosity. It was the look of a man who had underestimated his opponent and paid the price. The German gave the slightest of nods, an acknowledgement between warriors, before being led away. Marcus watched him go, reflecting on the strange turns his life had taken. 6 months ago he had been a replacement soldier, often ignored or relegated to menial tasks despite his abilities. Now he was being assigned to an engineering detachment to develop innovations for the entire division. All because he remembered what happened when wire tangled in his father's tractor back on a small farm in Georgia. As Marcus made his way back to his unit to collect his gear for the transfer, he thought about writing to his father. How would he explain what had happened? How could he convey that the mechanical intuition passed down from father to son had changed the course of a battle in a war that would reshape the world? In the distance, artillery rumbled, a reminder that while one small victory had been won, the larger struggle continued. German forces were regrouping, adapting, developing countermeasures. The war ground on, a massive machine of destruction that consumed men and material with insatiable hunger. But for the first time since landing on the beaches of Normandy, Marcus felt something beyond fear and determination. He felt purpose. His knowledge, so often dismissed because of the color of his skin, had proven valuable in ways no one could have predicted, including himself. The simple farm wisdom of a black sharecropper from Georgia had accomplished what millions of dollars of military engineering had not. It had found a vulnerability in the feared German Panzers that no one had anticipated. As Marcus shouldered his pack and prepared to report to his new assignment, he glanced back at the road where the burned-out hulks of German tanks still smoldered. The war was far from over, but something had changed, not just in the tactical situation, but in Marcus himself. He had arrived in Normandy as just another replacement soldier. He was leaving this position as the man who had stopped the Panzers with nothing but wire and determination. July 7th, 1944, Division Headquarters, near Carentan, Normandy. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the hastily assembled collection of tents and vehicles that comprised the forward engineering section of the United States First Army. Captain Lewis Reynolds, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and perpetually ink-stained fingers, studied the crude diagrams sketched on the paper before him. Around the makeshift table stood 4 other men, an unusual assembly of talent pulled from various units across the division. So you're saying the wire needs to be positioned at these specific heights to maximum effect? Reynolds asked, tapping the paper with a pencil. Yes, sir, Marcus Washington replied, pointing to his careful measurements. The lower strand targets the road wheels, middle one hits the return rollers, and the highest catches the drive sprocket. Triple strands work better than single. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. And the copper telephone wire is crucial? Not just any wire will do. The copper has the right combination of strength and malleability, sir. Steel wire often snaps on impact, and lighter gauge wire doesn't have enough tensile strength to wrap properly. For the past 3 weeks, Marcus had been attached to the Special Engineering Detachment under Captain Reynolds. His wire trap technique, initially an improvised solution born of necessity, was now being refined, tested, and documented for wider deployment. The initial success against the German Panzer column had sparked intense interest at division level and beyond. Lieutenant Colonel Howard Graham, a gruff artillery officer temporarily assigned to oversee the detachment, cleared his throat impatiently. All very interesting, but we have more pressing concerns now. The wire trap worked once, but the Germans aren't fools. They'll adapt quickly. He spread a larger map across the table. Intelligence reports they're developing their own countermeasures. We need to stay ahead of them. Graham wasn't wrong. Reports from the front indicated that German tank units were now deploying advanced scouts specifically looking for wire traps, and some Panzers had been fitted with crude wire-cutting devices welded to their front glacis plates. The impromptu innovation was already being countered by German engineers. "What else do you have for us, Washington?" Graham asked, his tone suggesting he expected little. Marcus hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small mechanical assembly he had been working on during his off hours. "I've been thinking about the hedgerow problem, sir." The Norman hedgerows, earthen banks topped with dense vegetation that had grown over centuries, formed natural walls up to 10 feet high around fields and roads throughout the region. These ancient boundaries had become a nightmare for American tanks, which struggled to climb over them, exposing their vulnerable underbellies in the process. German defenders used the hedgerows masterfully, turning the Norman countryside into a deadly maze. Reynolds leaned forward with interest. "Go on." "Our Sherman tanks have a high center of gravity and a flat bottom," Marcus explained. "When they try to climb these hedgerows, they tip up, exposing their undersides and getting stuck." He placed his crude model on the table. But what if we could cut through them instead of going over? What Marcus demonstrated next would eventually become known throughout the First Army as the Rhino device, an innovative modification that attached salvaged German beach obstacles to the front of Sherman tanks, creating makeshift prows that could slice through the hedgerows rather than climb them. Lieutenant Colonel Graham studied the model with newfound respect. "You came up with this on your own, Private?" "The basic idea, sir, but it will need proper engineering to implement." Captain Reynolds was already sketching refinements. "We could use I-beams or railroad track cut and welded to the front armor. With the right angle, it should work." Graham nodded decisively. "Reynolds, I want a working prototype within 48 hours. If this works, it could break the stalemate in the hedgerow country." He turned to Marcus. "Washington, you'll assist Captain Reynolds directly." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, surprised by the sudden elevation in his status. As the meeting dispersed, Reynolds clapped Marcus on the shoulder. "Not bad for a farm boy from Georgia," he said with a genuine smile. "Let's see if we can turn that idea into reality." In the days that followed, Marcus worked alongside the engineering team, helping to fabricate and test the first hedgerow cutting devices. His practical knowledge of metalwork, gained from years of repairing farm equipment, proved invaluable. What began as a simple concept evolved into a sophisticated modification that would transform the battlefield capabilities of American armor. The first field test was conducted under combat conditions on July 18th, with Marcus accompanying Captain Reynolds to observe from a safe distance. The sight of a Sherman tank slicing cleanly through a hedgerow that had stymied attacks for weeks brought spontaneous cheers from the watching infantry. Word spread rapidly. By late July, Rhino tanks, as they were quickly dubbed, were being modified across the division. The hedgerows, which had been Germany's strongest defensive asset in Normandy, suddenly became navigable. The transformation was remarkable. American tanks that had been limited to roads and existing gaps now moved cross-country with relative ease, flanking German positions that had previously been considered secure. For Marcus, these developments brought a level of recognition he had never expected. The young man who had arrived in Normandy as just another replacement soldier was now frequently consulted by officers planning armored operations. His understanding of mechanical problems and innovative solutions had earned him a respect that transcended the usual racial barriers of the 1940s American military. "Washington," Captain Reynolds said one evening, as they sat outside the engineering tent reviewing plans for the next day, "Division wants to send some of our innovations back to the States for evaluation and possible wider implementation." "That's good news, sir." "They want someone to accompany the report and demonstrate the techniques firsthand." Reynolds met his eye. "I recommended you." Marcus nearly dropped the cup of coffee he was holding. "Me, sir? Back to the States?" "You're the one who came up with the wire trap, and you contributed significantly to the Rhino device. Makes sense to send someone who understands the practical applications, not just the theory. The possibility of returning home, even temporarily, left Marcus speechless. Since landing on Omaha Beach 32 days earlier, he had assumed his next trip across the Atlantic would be either as a casualty or after the war ended, an event that still seemed years away. "I don't know what to say, sir," Reynolds smiled. "Say yes, Washington, you've earned it." But before any such plans could materialize, the fluid nature of war intervened. 3 days later, Operation Cobra, the major American breakout from the Normandy beachhead, commenced with a massive aerial bombardment followed by a coordinated ground assault. The entire front was in flux, and all personnel transfers were temporarily suspended. Instead of heading back to the United States, Marcus found himself attached to a forward tank battalion, working directly with tank crews to implement the innovations he had helped develop. The wire traps, now refined and standardized, were being used selectively at key choke points. The Rhino devices had become standard equipment on lead tanks. As July turned to August, the Allied forces broke free of the hedgerow country and began a rapid advance across France. The German forces, after weeks of stubborn defense, suddenly found themselves in headlong retreat. The entire character of the war in Western Europe transformed from static, hedgerow by hedgerow fighting to a war of movement and pursuit. On August 12th, Marcus was riding in a jeep with Captain Reynolds and 2 other engineers, following a column of Sherman tanks toward the town of Morton, when they encountered something unexpected. Along the roadside stood an elderly French farmer, waving frantically to get their attention. Reynolds ordered their driver to stop. "Monsieur, monsieur," the old man called in heavily accented English. "Germans, les Allemands, dans la forêt." He pointed urgently toward a thick forest that flanked the road about 500 meters ahead. Reynolds glanced at Marcus. "You getting any of this?" Marcus shook his head. "Not much, sir. Something about Germans in the forest." A young Frenchwoman, perhaps the old man's granddaughter, stepped forward with slightly better English. "German tanks. 6. They wait in trees. To attack you." Reynolds immediately radioed the information to the tank column commander. The lead tanks halted while reconnaissance was sent forward. Sure enough, a German ambush had been prepared, with 6 Panther tanks concealed among the trees, waiting for the American column to pass before striking it from the rear. Thanks to the warning, the American tanks deployed into defensive positions before the Germans realized their ambush had been discovered. When the Panthers emerged from the forest, they faced prepared opponents rather than vulnerable targets. In the brief but intense engagement that followed, 3 German tanks were disabled, while the others retreated. After the skirmish, Reynolds found the old Frenchman and his granddaughter still waiting by the roadside, anxious to learn the outcome. "You saved many American lives today," Reynolds told them through a translator. "Thank you." The old man nodded solemnly, then asked a question that the translator relayed. "He wants to know if you have more of the special wire, the kind that stops German tanks." Reynolds looked puzzled. "How does he know about that?" When the question was translated, the old man smiled toothlessly and pointed at his granddaughter. In halting phrases translated by the young woman, he explained that she had worked for the French telephone company before the war. When the Americans had first arrived in their area, she had observed soldiers collecting telephone wire. Later, she heard from resistance members about German tanks being disabled by wire traps. "She recognized what you were doing," the translator explained, "and she has shown others. The resistance has been using your technique against German vehicles for weeks now." Marcus listened in astonishment. His improvised solution, born from a Georgia farm accident, had been adopted by the French resistance and was being implemented throughout the countryside. What had begun as a desperate measure by a single platoon had evolved into a tactic employed across the entire front. Reynolds shook the old man's hand warmly. "Tell them we'll send a team with wire and proper instructions tomorrow." As they drove away, Reynolds glanced at Marcus with newfound respect. "Your wire trick has gone international, Washington. Not bad for a field-expedient solution." Marcus smiled modestly. "Just glad it's helping, sir." In mid-August, as Allied forces continued their advance across France, Marcus received unexpected news. His transfer back to the United States, delayed by Operation Cobra, had been approved. He was to report to division headquarters the following morning for transportation to Cherbourg, where he would board a ship bound for New York. The night before his departure, Captain Reynolds organized a small farewell gathering. To Marcus's surprise, many of the officers he had worked with over the past weeks attended, including Colonel Fitzpatrick and even Brigadier General Milligan. "Washington," Colonel Fitzpatrick said, raising a mug of Army coffee and toast, "when you get back to the States, make sure those rear echelon engineers understand that your innovations came from practical experience, not textbooks. We need more of that kind of thinking." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, still somewhat overwhelmed by the attention. Brigadier General Milligan stepped forward and handed Marcus an envelope. "Your Bronze Star came through, Private, officially for meritorious service in a combat zone, but we all know what it's really for." Marcus accepted the envelope with a mixture of pride and humility. "Thank you, sir." As the gathering dispersed, Captain Reynolds walked with Marcus back to his tent. "You know," Reynolds said thoughtfully, "before this war I was a mechanical engineering professor at Cornell, had all sorts of theories about how things should work." "Yes, sir. First week in Normandy taught me that theory and reality are often miles apart." Reynolds stopped and faced Marcus directly. "You've got a natural talent for engineering, Washington. Have you ever thought about studying it formally, after the war, I mean?" Marcus laughed softly. "College isn't exactly in the cards for someone like me, sir." "Why not?" "The Army's already talking about education benefits for veterans after the war, and I'd be happy to recommend you for Cornell or any other engineering program." The idea was so unexpected, so far beyond what Marcus had ever considered possible, that he had no ready response. His plans for after the war had never extended beyond returning to Georgia and perhaps using his army pay to help his father purchase their rented farmland. I'll think about it, sir." Reynolds nodded. "You do that. The world's changing, Washington. Men with your kind of talent shouldn't be limited by old boundaries." The following morning, Marcus boarded a transport truck bound for Cherbourg, carrying with him detailed documentation of the wire traps and other innovations he had helped develop. As the truck pulled away, he looked back at the temporary engineering compound that had been his home for the past month. Captain Reynolds stood at the entrance offering a final salute. Marcus returned the salute, then settled back as the truck joined a convoy heading north. Around him sat other soldiers also bound for the States, some wounded, some being rotated home after extended service, a few like himself on special assignments. The mood was subdued but hopeful. For most, this journey represented a temporary reprieve from the dangers of war. For Marcus, it represented something more, recognition of his contributions and abilities in a way he had never experienced in civilian life. In Georgia, his mechanical aptitude had been acknowledged only within the confines of his own community. In the Army, despite the segregation and prejudice that still existed, his innovations had been judged on their merits and found valuable. As their convoy passed through the Norman countryside, Marcus observed the changes that had occurred since D-Day. Villages that had been shattered by fighting were showing the first signs of recovery. French civilians worked alongside American engineers to clear rubble and repair essential services. The signs of war remained evident: burned-out tanks, shell craters, collapsed buildings, but life was gradually returning to normal. Near the port of Cherbourg, their convoy paused to allow a column of tanks to pass, brand-new Shermans fresh from the United States, each equipped with the Rhino device that Marcus had helped refine. The sight filled him with a quiet pride. "Those the new Rhinos?" asked a wounded sergeant sitting across from him, noticing Marcus's interest in the passing tanks. "Yes," Marcus replied simply. "Damn fine invention," the sergeant commented. "Saved our behinds in the hedgerows. Whoever came up with that deserves a medal." Marcus just smiled and said nothing. The ship that would carry Marcus back to the United States was the USS General W.P. Richardson, a troop ship primarily transporting wounded soldiers. As a military transport, the accommodations were Spartan but far more comfortable than the foxholes and makeshift shelters that had been his home in Normandy. Standing at the rail as the ship pulled away from the French coast, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been training at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, one of thousands of African-American soldiers preparing for deployment overseas. Few had expected to see actual combat, as most black units were assigned to service and supply roles despite their training. Now he was returning to the United States as the recognized innovator of techniques being implemented across the European theater of operations. The irony was not lost on him. During the Atlantic crossing, Marcus spent much of his time refining his reports and diagrams, ensuring that the engineers in the United States would fully understand the practical applications of his innovations. In the evenings, he often found himself drawn into conversations with officers and enlisted men, curious about his experiences. "So you're the wire trap guy?" a lieutenant from the 2nd Armored Division asked him one evening in the ship's mess hall. "Heard about that all the way down in Italy. Jerry tanks getting tangled up like flies in a spider web." "Word travels fast," Marcus observed with a smile. "Good ideas do, especially ones that work." The lieutenant extended his hand. "Jim Harwick, 2nd Armored. Marcus Washington, 761st Tank Battalion." They talked for hours, the usual barriers of rank and race temporarily suspended by their shared experiences and mutual respect. It was a conversation that would have been unimaginable in civilian life, yet seemed perfectly natural in the context of their wartime service. On September 1st, 1944, the USS General W.P. Richardson docked in New York Harbor. As the ship approached the familiar silhouette of the Statue of Liberty, soldiers lined the rails, many seeing their homeland for the first time in years. Some wept openly, others stood in reverent silence, and still others cheered at the sight of American soil. For Marcus, the moment was complicated by mixed emotions. He was returning not to Georgia, but to Washington, D.C., where he would spend 2 weeks at the Pentagon presenting his innovations to Army engineers and ordnance officers. After that, his future remained uncertain. He might be sent back to Europe, reassigned to a training unit in the States, or given some other duty entirely. A staff car was waiting for Marcus at the dock, a courtesy that immediately set him apart from the other returning soldiers. The driver, a young corporal, seemed surprised when Marcus identified himself. "You're Washington? The wire trap guy?" the corporal asked, making no effort to hide his astonishment at finding himself facing a black soldier. "That's right," Marcus confirmed, used to such reactions by now. "They've got a whole team waiting for your briefing tomorrow morning," the corporal informed him as they drove through the streets of New York. "Some pretty high-ranking brass, from what I heard." The Hotel Harrington in Washington, D.C. was a far cry from the mud and rain of Normandy. Marcus's room was small but private, a luxury after months of shared tents and foxholes. He spent the evening pressing his uniform and reviewing his notes, determined to make a good impression the following day. The Pentagon, with its massive scale and labyrinthine corridors, was intimidating even for someone who had faced German tanks. Marcus was escorted to a conference room where a dozen officers and civilian engineers waited, expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Colonel Walter Thurman, head of the Field Innovations Department, greeted Marcus with a firm handshake. "Private Washington, welcome. We've heard a great deal about your contributions in Normandy." For the next 3 hours, Marcus presented his wire trap technique, the Rhino device, and several other field modifications he had helped develop. He answered questions with the quiet confidence of someone who thoroughly understood his subject, demonstrating with models and diagrams how each innovation addressed specific battlefield challenges. By the end of the session, even the most skeptical officers were nodding in approval. Colonel Thurman approached Marcus as the meeting dispersed. "Impressive work, Washington. Truly impressive. I understand Captain Reynolds has recommended you for the Engineering Specialist program at Aberdeen Proving Ground." "Sir?" This was the first Marcus had heard of any such program. "It's a new initiative, identifying enlisted personnel with engineering aptitude and providing specialized training. Given your demonstrated abilities, you'd be a natural fit." Thurman studied him thoughtfully. "Interested?" For Marcus, whose highest educational aspiration had once been completing high school, the opportunity was both exciting and intimidating. "Yes, sir. Very interested." "Good. I'll process the paperwork immediately. You'll report to Aberdeen next week." The Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland housed the Army's Ordnance School and served as the primary testing facility for military vehicles and weapons. The engineering specialist program that Marcus joined consisted of 30 carefully selected enlisted men with demonstrated mechanical or engineering aptitude. To his surprise, 2 other African-American soldiers were among the group. Both, like him, had developed field innovations that had proven valuable in combat. The program combined classroom instruction with hands-on application, challenging the participants to identify battlefield problems and develop practical solutions. Marcus thrived in this environment, his natural abilities enhanced by formal training in engineering principles and design methodology. Major Frank Ellison, the program's director, took a particular interest in Marcus's progress. "Washington," he said, after observing Marcus troubleshoot a complex transmission problem that had stumped the other specialists, "you have a genuine talent for this work. Have you given any thought to what you'll do after the war?" "Captain Reynolds suggested I might consider college, sir. Engineering school." Ellison nodded approvingly. "You absolutely should. The GI Bill will help with that. But I was thinking more immediately about your military career. Have you considered officer candidate school?" The question caught Marcus completely off guard. In 1944, African-American officers were still rare in the U.S. Army, and most served only in segregated units. "I hadn't thought it was an option, sir." "Times are changing," Ellison replied. "Slowly, perhaps, but changing nonetheless. Men with your abilities shouldn't be limited to enlisted ranks." He paused, then added, "Think about it. I'd be happy to recommend you." As autumn progressed, Marcus continued his work at Aberdeen while contemplating the unexpected possibilities that had opened before him. Letters from his former unit in Europe brought news of continued advances against German forces, with many mentioning the ongoing effectiveness of the wire traps and rhino devices he had helped develop. One letter, from Captain Reynolds, included a newspaper clipping from Stars and Stripes that mentioned a Georgia farm boy's innovation that had transformed tank warfare in the hedgerow country. Though Marcus wasn't named in the article, Reynolds had circled the reference with a note in the margin. "This is you, Washington. Your ideas are making history." In late October, Marcus received unexpected news. He was to be promoted to technical sergeant and permanently assigned to the Aberdeen Engineering Development Team. Rather than returning to Europe, he would remain in Maryland, working on innovations for current and future battlefield challenges. The promotion ceremony was small but significant. Colonel Thurman himself pinned the sergeant's stripes on Marcus's uniform, with Major Ellison and several other officers in attendance. "Technical Sergeant Washington," Colonel Thurman said after the formal proceedings, "I've just received an interesting report from the European theater. Intelligence indicates that German tank units now include wire detection teams and have modified their training specifically to counter the trap technique you developed. In military terms, that's the highest form of compliment, when the enemy has to change their operations because of your innovation." "Thank you, sir," Marcus replied, genuinely moved by this information, "though I suspect they would have figured it out eventually, with or without me." "Perhaps," Thurman conceded, "but you gave our forces a crucial advantage when they needed it most. Never underestimate the value of that." In the months that followed, Marcus continued his work at Aberdeen, contributing to numerous projects aimed at improving American military equipment and developing countermeasures to German innovations. His particular expertise in field expedient solutions made him invaluable for developing modifications that could be implemented with limited resources and minimal specialized equipment. As winter settled over Maryland, news from Europe brought reports of the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. American forces, caught by surprise, were initially pushed back, but eventually held their ground and then regained the initiative. Among the reports that reached Aberdeen was a specific mention of wire traps being used effectively against German armor during the battle. The technique that Marcus had improvised on a Norman country road had become a standard tactic, employed whenever conditions were suitable. In February 1945, a distinguished visitor arrived at Aberdeen, Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, commanding general of Army Ground Forces. During his inspection tour, he requested specifically to meet with Technical Sergeant Marcus Washington. "Sergeant Washington," McNair said, shaking Marcus's hand firmly, "your innovations have made a significant difference in the European theater. I wanted to thank you personally." "Just doing my job, sir," Marcus replied, overwhelmed by the general's recognition. McNair smiled. "Your job?" "Your job description didn't include revolutionizing tank warfare, Sergeant. You went above and beyond, and the Army won't forget that." After the general's visit, Major Ellison approached Marcus with another surprising development. "Washington, how would you feel about a trip back to Georgia?" "Sir?" Marcus hadn't been home since his induction into the Army nearly 2 years earlier. "The War Department is conducting a bond drive, showcasing American ingenuity and innovation. They want you to speak at several events in the South, including one near your hometown." The prospect of returning to Georgia as a decorated sergeant, speaking publicly about his military experiences, seemed almost unimaginable. In the Georgia he had left behind, such recognition for a black man would have been inconceivable. "It might be complicated, sir." Ellison nodded, understanding. "The world is changing, Washington, not always as quickly as we might hope, but changing nonetheless. Your story, a farm boy whose simple idea changed the course of battles, resonates with people. It transcends the usual boundaries." After careful consideration, Marcus agreed to participate in the bond drive. In early March 1945, he found himself standing on a stage in Macon, Georgia, addressing an audience that included both white and black citizens, segregated in their seating, but united in their attention to his words. "Innovation doesn't always require complex technology or expensive equipment," he told them, his voice growing more confident as he spoke. "Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. A strand of wire, placed at the right height, with the right tension. Something any farmer might understand from working with machinery, proved more effective against German tanks than many weapons costing thousands of dollars." As he spoke, Marcus noticed an elderly black man sitting in the back of the colored section, listening intently. With a start, he recognized his father, Benjamin Washington, who had traveled from their small hometown to hear his son speak. After the presentation, as the crowd dispersed, Marcus made his way through the exiting attendees to where his father waited. They embraced wordlessly, the older man's eyes shining with unshed tears. "Heard you were speaking," Benjamin Washington said simply. "Had to come see for myself." "I'm glad you did, Pop." The elder Washington studied his son's uniform, noting the technical sergeant stripes and the Bronze Star medal with quiet pride. "Your mama would have been proud, boy, real proud." That evening, over a simple meal in the colored section of a local restaurant, Marcus shared stories of his experiences in Europe and at Aberdeen, carefully editing out the more harrowing details. His father listened attentively, asking occasional questions that revealed his intuitive understanding of mechanical principles, despite his limited formal education. "So that wire trick," Benjamin said, "that was from when old man Johnson's fence got caught in our tractor?" Marcus nodded, surprised his father had made the connection. "That's right. Remembered how it wrapped around everything, jammed up the works completely." "Huh." Benjamin Washington shook his head in wonder. "Never would have thought that broken-down old tractor would end up helping win a war." As they parted the next morning, Marcus to continue the bond drive tour and his father to return home, the elder Washington grasped his son's shoulder firmly. "You've found your path, son," he said. "Different from what I imagined for you, but a good one. Follow it wherever it leads." Those words stayed with Marcus through the remainder of the war and beyond. In April 1945, as Allied forces pushed deep into Germany, he received notification that he had been accepted into officer candidate school with a specialized focus on engineering and ordnance. In May, as Marcus began his officer training, news arrived of Germany's surrender. The war in Europe was over. The conflict in the Pacific would continue for several more months, but the defeat of Nazi Germany marked the beginning of the end of the global struggle. For Marcus Washington, the end of the war did not mean the end of his military service. The path that had begun with a desperate improvisation on a Norman country road led to a commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army Ordnance Corps, and eventually to a degree in mechanical engineering from Cornell University under the GI Bill, sponsored by Captain Reynolds, who returned to his professorship after the war. The wire trap technique that Marcus developed became a case study at military academies, an example of simple innovation with profound tactical impact. The Rhino device he helped refine was credited with breaking the stalemate in the hedgerow country, accelerating the Allied advance across France. Years later, in 1968, at the dedication of a new engineering facility at Aberdeen Proving Ground, an aging but still straight-backed Colonel Marcus Washington stood at the podium, addressing a new generation of military engineers. "Innovation doesn't always come from laboratories or design bureaus," he told them, echoing the words he had first spoken in Macon decades earlier. "Often it emerges from necessity, from the practical knowledge of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges." In the audience sat his father, now in his 80s but still alert, his weathered face creased in a proud smile. Beside him sat Captain, now Professor Emeritus, Lewis Reynolds, who had recognized potential where others had seen only limitations. After the ceremony, as the three men walked slowly across the Aberdeen grounds, they passed a display of historic military vehicles, including a preserved Panzer IV tank captured during the Normandy campaign. "Hard to believe something as simple as telephone wire could stop one of those," Reynolds commented, patting the massive steel track of the German tank. Marcus smiled, remembering the rain-soaked Norman countryside, the desperate improvisation, the unexpected recognition that followed. "Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective," he replied, echoing the lesson his father had taught him long ago on a small Georgia farm. Benjamin Washington laid a gnarled hand on the tank's steel flank, his expression thoughtful. "You know, all those German engineers, all their fancy technology, and they never thought about what happens when wire gets tangled in machinery." He chuckled softly. "Guess they never had to fix a broken-down tractor in the middle of harvest season." The three men laughed together, united by the understanding that true innovation often springs from the most unexpected sources, including a black sharecropper's son from Georgia who changed the course of tank warfare with nothing more than wire and the practical knowledge passed down from father to son. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.